Hi guys, so happy to welcome you back again. It occurred to me that this may be the first time some of you have ever listened to an opera before, and it's a very strange opera to begin with, Debussy's Pelléas and Melisande. I hope it wasn't a total turnoff. It is a very strange work. It is an admittedly frustrating and sometimes even boring work to begin with. But I hope by the end of our lecture today, you'll realize just how deep this work is and how its rather monotonous surface, beneath its rather monotonous surface, is this rich world of sounds, symbols, and meanings that reminds me a little bit of, there's a famous quote about Richard Wagner, that his music is better than it sounds. Doesn't totally apply here, maybe a little bit. Debussy's music does have a surface beauty to it, but it also has a meaning beneath the surface that I want to discuss today. And I think will really get you excited about this work. So with that, and with the mention of Richard Wagner, you'll notice that there's a certain name recurring like a leitmotif through our lectures, that of Richard Wagner. If you don't know what a leitmotif is, you'll certainly know by the end of today's lecture. For Wagner's name is synonymous with the leitmotif. Wagner, as you'll remember, from our first lecture, he totally transformed the arts in the 19th century in Europe. His ideas influenced not just music, though he was first and foremost a composer, but they permeated to every sphere of the arts, to theater, poetry, painting, even to architecture. I mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright's his style of architecture in our first lecture. The reason Wagner had such a broad appeal, as you'll remember, is that his theory of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, this theory embraced all elements of a theatrical production. Wagner was a composer, librettist, and stage director all rolled into one. He oversaw every part of his operas, ensuring the visual, textual, and musical components were working together to achieve the grand theatrical vision he had in mind. No single art form would outrank any of the others. Rather, they would work together in a perfect union. One medium would pick up where the other one left off, with the weaknesses of one art form being filled in by the strengths of the others. Their combined forces, working toward the same artistic goal, would achieve an all-absorbing, multisensory theatrical event that was more akin to a religious ritual than a mere opera. In fact, Wagner, to emphasize that he viewed what he was doing as a totally new art form, stopped calling his works operas and instead labeled them music dramas to show that the compositional and theatrical elements were on equal footing. The new term for this genre also indicates the radical changes he had made to the traditional poetic format of an operatic libretto. A libretto, you'll remember, is the sung text. In a typical opera libretto, the author alternates between passages in verse, that is, the passages that have a regular meter and rhyme scheme typically, and passages that are in prose, that is, passages written in ordinary language without meter. The prose passages are the portions of the libretto that move the plot along. Typically, it's dialogue between the characters. This can be either left spoken, although we typically think of opera as sung through. There are many subgenres in opera that include spoken dialogue, including Bizet's Carmen, premiered with the scenes with the soloists speaking. They would stop singing and converse in regular speech and then pick up singing again, rather like the modern day American musical. Usually, however, the composer uses a style of musical text setting for these non-metric scenes that's called recitative or recitative, which comes from the same root word as the English word recitation or recite. but they're not literally speaking or reciting. Rather, the singers employ a very speech-like singing style. The notes and rhythms are notated specifically in the score, but they imitate the natural cadence of speech, looser and more flexible. So when I just said that sentence, but they imitate the natural cadence of speech. So the composer, if you were to translate that to recitative, would give a very fast rhythm for the long note for but, then a pause, and then faster for imitates the natural rhythm of speech. Those would all be 16th notes. So these recitative passages are the moments in the opera when stuff happens. They're not of much musical interest, as you'd imagine from what I just said, since it's close to everyday speech. It moves us toward the more song-like passages. So in this recitative passage from Gounod's opera Faust, you can see how the lines are of variable length, and there are only two that seem to rhyme, although this might just be coincidental between quoi and pourquoi. And see how Gounod's setting of the recitative text is very rapid, imitating the speed and cadence of spoken French, rather than creating a lovely and memorable melody. He's rushing through this section at the first measure there. See how he stuffs over 10 words into one measure so that he can get to the good stuff, which is Marguerite's, the character Marguerite's famous Jewel song, which belongs to the other more song-like category of operatic sections. So let's listen to this, this excerpt.
Je n'en sais toucher, et pourtant, voici la clé, je crois. Si je l'ouvrais, même tremble. Pourquoi je ne fais en vrai rien de mal, je suppose. Oh Dieu, tous mes jours, et sans rêve, je manque de bruit. Oh, si je veille.
So balancing these recitative moments are song-like passages, we might call them. These are the big arias. Those are solo numbers, duets, ensembles, or choruses that you leave the theater humming. You're sure as heck are not going to be humming the recitative. So we call them, and I just called them numbers, since they used to be given actual numerals. Number 7 is so-and-so's revenge aria. Number 8 is so-and-so and what's-her-face's love duet. And you'll still hear people refer to a Broadway number, and that's a reference to the song-like passages in a musical and also in an opera. So these sections are identifiable in the score because they're, or in the text rather, because they're in rhyming verse with regular meter. And the composer will take advantage of the repetition of syllables and rhyme scheme by applying the same musical phrase to similarly structured lines of verse. You'll remember this passage from Delilah's aria in Samson and Delilah by Saint-Saëns. And you can see how Saint-Saëns sets these rhyming lines to an identical descending melody. Remember, we discussed this descending D-flat major scale with the added chromaticism. So there's a musical parallel between the regularity of the verse and the regularity of the melody. These song-like passages don't have much dramatic action in them, like the recitative passages do. They're the moments when the characters reflect, monologize, that is to deliver a monologue, or apostrophize. They comment on whatever action has occurred during the recitative, expressing musically and poetically how much they love or hate each other. These numbers, again, what we term these song-like selections, are the emotional core of the opera. The music in these sections is driven by the powerful feelings of the characters, usually expressed in very difficult and virtuosic vocal techniques. Wagner, however, sensed something very clunky and unnatural about this alternation between verse and prose, recitative and number, speech-like music and song-like music, and action and reaction. The musical and emotional energy of the numbers, the arias and the duets, rather than propelling us forward, is cut short by the interruption of recitative to hurry the plot along. Likewise, the dramatic and dialogic action of the recitative, however unmusical, is cut short by the emotional interruptions of the numbers. Wagner sought a smoother flow of action and emotion in his music dramas, something closer to the natural progression of spoken drama, but which still retained the sense of melodic lyricism and tonal drive of symphonic music. So we can get a sense of this from the god Wotan's famous and extremely long monologue from the Valkyrie, which is the second opera of Wagner's four-part Ring cycle. Another composer would have set this as an aria with rhyming lines set to some big tragic melody that repeats several times. This is an emotional climax for Wotan, or Odin, the chief of the Norse gods, whom you may know from Marvel Comics. He realizes that all his grand designs for the fate of the universe have failed, and that all that awaits he and the other gods is their inevitable downfall, the twilight of the gods, or the Ragnarok. Let's see in this excerpt from the monologue how Wagner totally drops the regular meter. The lines are variable in length. Notice especially the third line, which is 10 syllables versus the 7 and 6 syllables of the previous lines. Most of the ends of the lines don't rhyme either. Rather, in that 10-syllable line we looked at, Wagner employs a kind of internal pseudo-rhyme with 3 words beginning with F. That's a technique that he borrowed from medieval Germanic poetry that's called alliterative verse, because of the alliteration, the repeated consonants at the beginnings of the words. Wagner reserves a rhyme scheme for the section where Wotan foresees the coming Ragnarok. It's a special moment that builds up to the big climax of the monologue. His repeated phrase, das Ende, or the end, which sets the remainder of the opera, and indeed the whole Ring cycle, in motion. Turning to the musical setting, you'll notice that it seems to hover between recitative style and the more song-like style of traditional operatic numbers. On the one hand, Wotan's vocal line doesn't have the swift, get it out of the way rhythms of Gounod's recitative passage we heard from Faust. In Wagner, there's a variation of pacing with longer, higher notes for the important words, like das Ende. And yet this isn't a part of the opera that you're going to leave the theater humming. There's nothing in Wotan's vocal line that sounds quite melodic. And in fact, there are parts that sound more like concentrated shouting than singing. Also, there are no neatly formed symmetrical phrases or repetitions of phrases, or at least nothing like the descending D-flat major scale in Delilah's aria, which is so obviously repeated the same way twice and sticks in our ear because of that repetition. In line with the concept of the music drama, Wagner developed a more flexible and dramatically motivated form of text setting, often referred to as endless melody. There's a sense of continuous and undivided flow of music without the choppy breaking up of the score into recitative and numbers. There are passages in his music dramas that lean toward the song-like, and then there's others that lean toward recitative, depending on what the drama calls for at a given moment. Yet there's no firm and fixed divisions or alternations between these two categories, as in a traditional opera. The vocal line moves along a kind of continuum between these two extremes, song-like and speech-like, but it usually hovers somewhere in the middle. The example I played from Wotan's monologue leans toward recitative, but I'll play a gorgeous example later in this lecture that sounds closer to a traditional operatic aria. Wagner didn't totally give up beautiful and lyrical vocal writing. You see, he was aware of the dangers of this new style of text setting, which, while innovative, could grow tedious. What's more, he was a natural melodist, and his earlier operas are filled with gorgeous arias in the vein of traditional operatic numbers. Also, by doing away with the alternation between recitative and numbers, Wagner had eliminated the basis of an opera's form. There was a sense of musical symmetry, regularity, and variety in this alternation, in this traditional alternation, and also within the numbers themselves, which were often structured in balanced binary or tripartite forms, ABA forms, or verse-chorus structures. Wagner's solution to these two problems, the lack of conventional melody in his vocal line and the lack of formal structure in the score, was the creation of a complex system of short musical themes or mottos called leitmotifs. The word leitmotif comes from the German verb leiten, meaning to lead or to guide. And then a motif is a recurring idea or image within a work of art, often with a thematic or symbolic meaning. It's not necessarily musical. It can be something literary or visual. So in the Harry Potter books, there's all the snakes that appear, and those could be considered a motif associated with evil or cunning or craftiness. There's the snake that Harry talks to, the basilisk he kills, Voldemort's pet Nagini. Is that the name of it? I know it's the name of it. I'm pretending like I don't know. And then there's the one on Slytherin's, the Slytherin crest. So there's all this web of associations with the snake and different characters, and Harry, the fact that part of Voldemort is in Harry and he can talk to with the parcel tongue and stuff. You know, there's this very complex web of meaning that's encapsulated in this snake figure, the snake motif. In music, a motif is typically very short, no longer than a few measures, and usually only a measure or two. But it should be compact and memorable, marked by some defining rhythmic or melodic feature that's evocative of whatever it is it's representing. But it also has to stand out and be recognizable upon subsequent reiterations. What makes them leitmotifs, or leading, guiding motifs, is the fact that Wagner attaches them to specific people, places, objects, and ideas, nouns. The leitmotif accompanies a character when she first enters, or a concept like a curse or a desire for revenge when it's first mentioned. Upon subsequent entries of a character or subsequent mentions of an idea in the text, these leitmotifs return like musical memories. But there are also times when a character isn't on stage or even being mentioned in the libretto, but we still may hear their leitmotif because something in the text or the action is implicitly reminding us of that character, as if they were in the back of our mind. Or even if it's not in the back of our mind, the composer may be very clever and wants to put it in the back of your mind and say to you, what's going on right here, this may have some significance for Wotan or for Siegfried or Brunhilde. At the most basic level, leitmotifs help to organize the score of a massive music drama, like the 4-part Ring cycle. They allow for musical repetition, which had previously emerged naturally from the poetic repetition, the natural rhyme scheme and meter of a text. As we drift our way through Wagner's endless melody, the leitmotifs serve as like signposts, organizing both the plot and the music and helping us to keep track of all the creatures, deities, and magical objects that populate Wagner's mythical world in these four massive operas, which total to 17 hours of music over 4 nights. The leitmotifs can also help to catalog all the emotions and characters and their motivations, whether they're seeking love, revenge, power, wealth. All these abstract feelings and desires are musically encapsulated in their own unique leitmotifs in the Ring Cycle. While leitmotifs sometimes make their way into the vocal line, in Wagner's opera, they're primarily the domain of the orchestra. The orchestra had, for most of operatic history, been relegated to a mere accompanimental status. And this is, I'm stereotyping a little bit, but far less than in Wagner's opera. They more or less provided this kind of pa rhythmic and harmonic basis to support the singer, who is the main center of musical and dramatic attention, both the singer themselves and their vocal line. But Wagner, in the spirit of the Gesamtkunstwerk, gave the orchestra a more involved role in the music dramas. They're constantly punctuating the vocal line with statements of different leitmotifs. Even if the singer isn't singing those leitmotifs, you'll still hear them from the orchestra. And they're given extended interlude passages that seem to reflect on the opera through the interactions and combinations of different leitmotivic themes within an interlude, not with anyone singing. Remember that Wagner's ideal model for the Gesamtkunstwerk was ancient Greek drama. And indeed, the role of the Greek chorus has been transferred in his music dramas to the orchestra. There are very rarely, in Wagner's later operas, there are very rarely literal choruses. That role is given to the orchestra. Their continuous stream of leitmotifs comment on the drama in the way that the Greek chorus used to do, telling us what characters are thinking, what characters may not know, or reminding us of relevant information that may not be explicitly stated in the text. I should also point out that in its chorus-like commentary of leitmotifs, the orchestra doesn't simply regurgitate the themes in the same way each time. Rather, the themes are slightly altered, rhythmically, harmonically, even maybe slightly melodically, so that they retain their identity, but they take on a new quality or a new emotion. These subtle variations can transform the meaning of the leitmotifs and allow them to better apply to a dramatic situation. So take, for instance, that leitmotif you heard right after Wotan's cries of Das Ende, das Ende. Let's listen to it again. So this sounds like a very dark and foreboding theme, especially since it's placed in the murky low brass. But listen now to the initial appearance of this leitmotif, from all the way from the beginning of the first Ring Cycle opera, Das Rheingold. So it's the same motive, but now it's bubblier and brighter, placed in the high strings. Now this leitmotif represents the Rhine River. It's a real river in Germany, but within the mythology of the Ring Cycle, it's the location of a magical hunk of gold, das Rheingold, the gold in the Rhine River. In the Ring Cycle, the titular piece of jewelry, the ring, is crafted from this magic hunk of gold, but its power is corrupting and used for evil, like the ring in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which those books are based on the same Norse myths and Germanic sagas as Wagner's operas are. They were consulting the same mythic sources. And if you're a big fan of the Lord of the Rings, I highly recommend checking out the Ring Cycle. There's even graphic novel adaptation by the same artist whose Pelias adaptation you read. So that could be a starting place. So on the first appearance of this leitmotif that symbolizes the Rhine River, the Rheingold hasn't been stolen from the depths. The opera hasn't even started yet. It's the prelude to the first Ring Cycle opera. Wagner is painting the picture of a mighty and deep river that flows endlessly, representing the cycle of nature, the cycle of the opera, etc. You can't hear it in the snippet that I just played, but the prelude starts at the lowest possible pitch in the orchestra and then moves upwards pitch-wise, as if we've started at the riverbank and are moving up toward the surface. The aquatic textures and instrumentations grow brighter, faster, and livelier as we ascend, as if the sun were starting to penetrate to the upper layers of water. But in Wotan's monologue from the second Ring Cycle opera, Die Valkyrie, in his monologue, he realizes that the ring has to be returned to the Rhine, which will bring about the end of the race of gods for reasons that I don't quite understand and are too complicated to explain here. In this case, the Rhine River is a symbol of cyclical return, yet one that even though the life is cyclical and the river is cyclical, the race of gods is not cyclical and will come to an end. It's an inevitable yet terrifying outcome from Wotan's angle, especially since he bears the guilt for his own apocalyptic downfall. When we hear the Rhine River leitmotif, during his monologue, that is, we hear it filtered through Wotan's emotions and the dramatic situation. It's no longer the bubbling and energetic source of this magical gold, and indeed the symbolic source of the Ring Cycle as a whole, since it appears in the prelude to the first opera. Rather, we hear it as something murky and ominous, the end point of Wotan's fate. By the way, here's the most famous leitmotif from the Ring Cycle, which stands for the 9 Valkyries, the armored warrior maidens who ride on flying horses and collect the souls of heroes slain in battle. They bring them to these dead heroes to serve the gods in Valhalla. I'll also add here that Wagner's leitmotif system had a major influence on film score composition. So John Williams' leitmotifs for the Star Wars characters are especially Wagnerian, not just in the way he treats them as leitmotivically, but the actual style of music sounds very Wagnerian. And so the sound of the Imperial March, for instance, will instantly conjure Darth Vader in your mind through that visual association, but also the character of the music suggests, somebody rigid and dictatorial and militaristic, and that it's a military march. So there's all this layers of meaning, and that's totally indebted to Wagner. I'm sure Williams would be the first to admit that. So, returning to symbolism. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a veritable Wagner mania, with die-hard fans making special pilgrimages to the little German town of Bayreuth, B-A-Y-R-E-U-T-H, where Wagner had constructed an opera house to his staging specifications, a theater that would serve as a kind of temple to his art, and where only his massive music dramas would be performed. So artists who were dealing with many different styles and mediums were able to adopt Wagner's ideas and the leitmotif or the Gesamtkunstwerk. They could adopt these to fit their own specific needs. The symbolists, who you'll remember from last week, were especially notorious Wagnerites. They latched onto the mystical and quasi-religious dimensions of Wagner's later music dramas, especially the 1865 medieval romance Tristan und Isolde. While I only kind of hinted at this in our discussion of Mallarmé last lecture, symbolists were obsessed with the concept of synesthesia. This is an actual perceptual phenomenon that's present in a few people, where the senses become mixed or paired. One of the more common varieties is chromesthesia, when sounds, especially musical sounds, evoke colors to the perceiver. Not just the metaphorical tone colors we discussed, but literal shades. It's often systematic in their brain, systematically wired, with this harmony always associated with that hue. The symbolist composer Alexander Scriabin, who wasn't actually synesthetic, he invented his own system of color to key relationships that he employed in his music. This was kind of a pseudo synesthesia. He even invented a color organ that would project beams of colored light whenever the key changed in his music. And recall also that Mallarmé attempted a similar kind of pseudo-synesthesia in his poetry, combining words less for their semantic meaning than for their musical quality. Remember, music was always the ultimate for the symbolist poets because of its ineffability. You can imagine how Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk concept, his ideas about the unity of different art forms that appeal to the different senses, you can imagine how this appealed to the symbolist artists and poets. Even if they weren't producing works of theater or opera for that matter, they could adapt Wagner's theories to their individual art forms, which they attempted to make all-embracing and multisensorial in the spirit of a Wagnerian music drama. But Wagner also provided a model for writers with the more poetic passages of his librettos, which anticipate symbolist poetry in their rapturous evocations of synesthetic episodes. The most famous example is the final number of Wagner's greatest music drama, at least in my opinion, Tristan und Isolde from 1865. The titular Isolde has finally reunited with her lover, the knight Tristan, only for him to die in her arms. At that moment, she undergoes an indescribable spiritual experience that she's only able to convey in synesthetic language. She feels some force emerging from Tristan and enveloping her in a psychedelic swirl of sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and sensations. All five senses are evoked, as you can see in the bolded passages of the text. After the climax of this otherworldly transfiguration, Isolde gives up her spirit and is joined for all eternity with Tristan in what she calls supreme bliss. Hence the name of this passage, the Liebestod, or love-death.
Oh
You can imagine what an overpowering and visceral experience it would have been for young symbolist artists hearing this supercharged combination of an ecstatic female voice, a synesthetic text, and this positively orgasmic musical climax, which has been building over the past 4 hours. It's the most vivid musical depiction of sexual release that's ever been composed. So, with the sound of Isolde's euphoric high G sharps still ringing in our ears, we can now plunge ourselves into the near silence of Belgian playwright Maurice Maeterlinck's shadowy drama Pelléas et Mélisande, which premiered in Paris in 1893. And again, I just want to emphasize that for this next part of the lecture, we're discussing the text, the spoken play of Maeterlinck's drama, and we will get to Debussy's operatic adaptation, I promise. Now, for a work whose aesthetic is so diametrically opposed to Tristan, or at least on the surface, Maeterlinck's play tells almost the exact same story as Wagner's opera. So in Act 1 of Tristan and Isolde, the titular English knight Tristan is bringing home the captured Irish princess Isolde as a bride for his master, King Mark of Cornwall. However, on the boat ride back to Cornwall, Tristan and Isolde fall in love, which is due to a rather embarrassing mix-up where Isolde is trying to poison Tristan and accidentally gives him a love potion. We can forget that plot point, though. In Act 2, Isolde has already married King Mark, but she and Tristan meet in a secret garden tryst at night. A Tristan tryst. Locked in each other's embrace, they're discovered by King Mark and his knights, one of whom injures Tristan in a sword fight. In Act 3, Tristan lays mortally wounded on an island, and Isolde joins him there, only to find that it's too late. He dies from his injury, and Isolde launches into her Liebestod, which we had just heard some. Wagner's opera is actually based on a 12th century medieval romance, but with all the Wagner mania going on at the time, that when Maeterlinck wrote Pelléas, it's no doubt that Maeterlinck had both the medieval text and Wagner's adaptation in mind when he was writing. While Pelléas and Mélisande isn't explicitly based on any existing legend, you can see how heavily Maeterlinck borrowed from the Tristan myth for his own tale set in some vague medieval time. Not the restaurant medieval times, the time period. Mélisande, for instance, is a former princess, or at least we think she is, since she has a crown, and she comes from some distant land and is brought to a new kingdom on a boat. Though there's a slight difference in that Golot brings her to his kingdom rather than the more Tristan-like Pelléas. But Golot obviously stands in for King Mark. He marries Mélisande and is betrayed by someone he trusted, in Maeterlinck's case, his half-brother Pelléas. Pelléas and Mélisande, like the lovers in Tristan and Isolde, they meet in a castle garden at night and are discovered by Golot, with Pelléas being mortally wounded in the way that one of King Mark's knights wounds Tristan. Though Pelléas dies immediately and doesn't have an additional act to sing like Tristan does. And while Mélisande does have a death scene in the final act, it's nothing like the ecstatic Liebestod of Isolde, but something quite sad and quiet. In fact, this contrast in how the respective heroines' deaths are depicted, Isolde going out with a bang and Mélisande with a whimper, this contrast encapsulates the vastly divergent aesthetic approaches in these two theatrical works, despite the fact that superficially they tell the same story. Now, obviously, we're comparing a spoken play to a sung-through opera, but I think it's worth considering, especially since many of the qualities of Maeterlinck's drama carry over into Debussy's operatic setting. So this was another source of inspiration for Maeterlinck, these artists who belonged to an English movement called the Pre-Raphaelite movement around the middle of the 19th century. Although this is actually a dummy slide. I will mention here that that the Pre-Raphaelites were interested in reviving the style of medieval art, and you can see why that would have appealed to Metterlink. But really, this slide is to give you your attendance link. So again, it always starts off with https://forms, the word forms, .gle, as in the last three letters of Google, /, and then here are your strange mixture of numbers and letters. Capital P as in potato, lowercase v as in vegetable, lowercase e as in echo, capital S as in Samantha, lowercase m as in Monica, the number 7, capital S as in Samantha, lowercase w as in watermelon, capital U as in umbrella, capital W as in watermelon, lowercase g as in giraffe, capital W as in watermelon, lowercase c as in Charlie, lowercase o as in octopus, lowercase q as in queen, uppercase F as in Frank, and the number 6. Again, that's https://forms.gle/ and these numbers and letters. Here we go again. Capital potato, lowercase vegetable, lowercase echo, capital Samantha, lowercase Monica, the number 7, capital Samantha, lowercase watermelon, capital umbrella, capital watermelon, lowercase giraffe, capital watermelon again, lowercase Charlie, lowercase octopus, lowercase queen, uppercase Frank, and the number 6. And as always, you can just message me directly if you're not getting the link to work. Characters in Wagner's operas, and Tristan especially, they never shut up. They go on in lengthy stretches of sung prose, often monologizing at one another rather than conversing with one another in dialogue. That 1-minute clip that I played you of Wotan proclaiming the end of the gods, that's just the tippy tail of the end of what is a 20-minute monologue that actually recaps what happened in the last opera and a half of the Ring cycle, not hour and a half. It tells you what happened in the first in Das Rheingold, and then what's most of what's going on in Die Walküre, the second opera. Now, this has a musical reason, this use of long stretches of text. You need these stretches of uninterrupted singing for the soloists to have their moment in the spotlight. But you also have likely seen a spoken equivalent of this for instance, in Shakespeare, how characters have an equivalent spoken monologue. Notably Hamlet's famous "to be or not to be" speech, which he delivers to himself as a theatrical aside. Maeterlinck, though his gloomy medieval setting might recall Hamlet, he rarely gives his characters private moments of introspection. Now, if a character does appear alone, their speech isn't a self-reflective monologue, but simply a means of setting the scene, like Golo does here at the very beginning of the play, telling us just the facts, that he was hunting, he wounded an animal, he's lost, he sees a girl weeping at the edge of the water. Wagner's characters tend to over-explain everything. There are lots of moments in the Ring cycle that are like Wotan's monologue, where you get the plot totally recapped, everything you've just been sitting through for the last few nights. Maeterlinck's characters, on the other hand, under-explain everything. Not so much in their descriptions of whatever is already visible on stage. Actually, it seems like most of what they discuss in their dialogue is elements that we can already see for ourselves on stage. Where in the castle they are, what the weather's like, whether it's light out or dark. But we get very little information about the important aspects of a drama. Their motivations, their desires, their emotions. These are what Wagner's characters never stop telling us about. But they remain mysteries in Maeterlinck. Even crucial details are left out. Melisande especially remains such an enigmatic figure because she flat out refuses to give Golot her background in the first scene. Never at any point in the play do we learn where Melisande was from, who hurt her, why she's weeping, and why she has a crown. I said earlier that she's a princess like Isolde, but even that isn't certain. All we know is that she has a crown and she doesn't want it retrieved from the water. Even if we know a little bit more about the other characters in the drama, they still remain shrouded in mystery, or given our discussion last week, their personalities are deliberately veiled through symbolist ambiguity. Maeterlinck leaves gaps in the dialogue that we're forced to contemplate and fill in ourselves as the audience. The character statements often disintegrate into ellipses, that ... punctuation. You can't really tell it from the graphic novel I had you read, since the artist, for good reason, left out most of the ellipses. They take up too much space in the speech bubbles. But you can see from this English translation, which reproduces the punctuation in the original French, how often Maeterlinck ends lines of dialogue with ellipses. Now, for the actors, these could be interpreted as a slight pause, a means of pacing the alternation between speech and silence. But for the reader, if you're reading the play, they give one the sense that something is being withheld, that there are things that the characters mean to say, but don't. In fact, there are times when they don't even answer one another's questions, leaving a pregnant silence that says more than if they did answer the question. The best example is when Peleas tells Melisande he'll be leaving tomorrow. Though he doesn't say he is leaving, just that he may be leaving. Melisande asks why he's leaving. Remember, he has a sick friend that he keeps meaning to visit, but he doesn't respond. So we as an audience have to fill in what he may be thinking and the reason for his silence as well. Perhaps he's testing to see how Melisande would react. She gives her little exclamation of, "Oh," that's a phrase she uses a lot in the play. And that may indicate that she doesn't want him to go. Again, it's vague. We have to fill in what a single "oh" can mean. And perhaps the silence that follows, Peleas in his mind during that silence is either consciously or unconsciously deciding to postpone his trip so that he can stay with Melisande, which we see in the next scene as what does happen. He's still there. But Maeterlinck doesn't have Peleas flat out tell us he's starting to fall in love with Melisande in some cheesy monologue. The playwright only subtly suggests Peleas's attraction through his sparse, unfinished dialogue and even his silences. This is the theatrical equivalent to Mallarmé's poetic symbolist techniques. Language here in Maeterlinck, as in the Afternoon of a Faun, doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't clarify, define, and explain, but multiplies the numbers of meanings and possibilities. But whereas Mallarmé achieves this through obscure metaphorical constructions like the bushy sleeps that we discussed last week's, Maeterlinck's symbolism is one of minimalism. When they do answer one another, the character's diction and sentence structure is simple, naive, and childlike. Though this compactness of language, rather than making the dialogue direct and unequivocal, only makes it more ambiguous, as you can take these simple statements in any number of directions, even a simple word like "oh." There's a terrific example of this at the end of the scene where Golot discovers Melisande in the forest, which I've shown here. She asks where he's going. He responds, "I don't know. I too am lost." At its most simple level, this statement refers to the fact that Golot was hunting and he's lost his way. But it's also rather ironic that he has found Melisande, though they both remain lost. But I think you could see how new layers of meaning pile up as the drama continues, and we see other ways in which Golot becomes metaphorically lost in his jealousy and his rage. You might find Maeterlinck's symbolist approach to drama too alienating, too uneventful, and perhaps even a little boring. But to return to our discussion from the first lecture, where I explained the modernist goal of more accurately conveying the subjective experience, we should give Maeterlinck's vague dialogue another chance. There's something about this near muttered, half-explained manner of speaking with its indirect meanings and elliptical statements. There's something about that that feels closer to emotions as we actually experience them. Rarely do we feel intense waves of only happiness, only anger, or only sadness, as if we were Sesame Street Muppets who sum up our feelings as glad, sad, or mad. We usually conceal our feelings, bottling them up and only allowing those with whom we are most intimate to know our deepest pleasures and our deepest pains. But even then, we can never truly communicate the way we feel, just like the characters in Pelléas and Melisande. We might only experience emotions as a vague sense in the back of our mind or down in the pits of our stomachs. It's something that never quite surfaces, a sensation we can't really pin on anything. That's why I find Melisande, in all her frustrating ambiguity, such a compelling character. From a present-day perspective, her lack of agency might appear misogynistic on Maeterlinck's part. She rarely makes her own decisions, but is acted upon and ultimately destroyed by the men around her. We see how she's even physically abused by Golot, who whips her around by her long hair. Even before the play begins, Melisande has been abused by some man, whoever the unnamed he was, who gave her the crown, and whose identity she withholds from Golot when he asks her. It's another instance of a question left unanswered in this play. Now, in your own staging of Debussy as Pelléas for the final project, if you choose that, you might try to incorporate some stage action that gives Melisande some greater agency. But I think if you're going to force a go-get-em Elsa from Frozen persona in Melisande, you'd be missing the point. Melisande, though she appears like a misogynistic stereotype of a weak-willed and weeping woman, is something so much deeper. Anyone who has experienced depression will instantly recognize the humanity in Melisande, the way she feels an intense yet unnameable sadness that nothing seems able to relieve, how her sadness even seems to be reflected in the gloomy world around her, yet she can't quite pinpoint its source. Only a theatrical style as restrained and introverted as Maeterlinck's brand of symbolism could capture the nebulous yet all-pervading melancholy that seems to consume you when you suffer from depression. So, it seems like we've strayed as far as we could from Wagner. While Tristan likely inspired the initial creative impetus for Maeterlinck's medieval tale, Wagner's intense musical emotionality couldn't be further removed from Maeterlinck's shadowy, symbolist dream world. And yet, Wagner nevertheless re-enters the picture when we consider the rich language of symbols that Maeterlinck employs in his play. So recall from last week's lecture what Mallarmé, and so not Maeterlinck, Mallarmé, the author of Afternoon of a Faun, what he had to say about how to take a symbolist approach to poetry. He writes, choose an object and from it elicit a state of soul by means of a series of decoding. Likewise, in his Symbolist Manifesto of 1886, the Greek poet Jean Moria writes, so in this art, that is in symbolist art, pictures from nature and human actions and all concrete phenomena are never allowed to manifest in themselves. They are in the artwork as sensible appearances designed to represent their esoteric affinities. Or, in plainer language, in a work of symbolism, objects and places that appear never simply exist in and of themselves, but represent higher ideas that exist on a spiritual or emotional plane. These ideas are impossible to put into words. As Mallarmé says, the object must be gradually evoked, and Moria says that the artist should never go so far as to conceive the idea in itself. The only way to get even close to expressing these ideas is through the symbol, which encompasses several layers of meaning, many of them subjective. You might start to see why Wagner's leitmotifs represented the ultimate symbols for the symbolists. Wagner's musical symbols transcend the rational world of language and image to become pure sound, and yet sound that can synesthetically convey both concrete objects as well as a complex web of emotion and meanings that are attached to these mere objects or to the people and places that the leitmotifs represent. The leitmotifs aren't simply musical name tags, as many critics, including Debussy, as we'll see later, as many critics have pejoratively dubbed them. As we saw with the Rhine River motive, Wagner's leitmotifs transform and take on new musical characteristics whenever they appear in a new dramatic context. The Rhine River motive remains attached to the river itself, that's true, but the theme accumulates new layers of meaning. For Wotan, the river is no longer a bubbly body of water with secret treasures in its depths, but it comes to represent the downfall of the gods. And we saw how this meaning is conveyed in Wagner's treatment of that leitmotif at the end of Wotan's monologue, how it becomes something foreboding rather than something energetic and aquatic. Whether or not Maeterlinck has Wagner in mind, his visual symbols and Pelléas seem to translate Wagner's musical leitmotifs into literary equivalents. There are plenty of examples in Maeterlinck's play, and by extension in Debussy's opera, which we're about to get to. So symbols like hair, water, forests, sheep being led to slaughter, wells, caves, doves, blindness. And we'll get into the most prevalent motif later in this lecture, which is lightness and darkness. For now, as a brief example, I'll call your attention to a very striking visual leitmotif in the play, consisting of 3 circular golden objects: Melisandre's abandoned crown, her wedding band, and Ineold's gold ball. Each of these have their own independent associations. So the crown stands in for Melisandre's tragic past, while also hinting at her former status, we presume, as royalty. The ring, of course, like any wedding ring, represents the bond of matrimony, in Melisandre's case with Golot. But the fact that she loses the ring, and at the very same moment that Golot is injured in the woods, itself a symbolic event, the fact that she loses the ring gives the ring another layer of symbolic meaning, especially when we remember that it's in this scene in the garden that she starts to fall in love with Pelléas, or at least we can deduce that from her, from what she says. Finally, Ineold's gold ball might remind us of his innocence as a child to the drama unfolding around him. He's concerned only with playthings, and he couldn't understand his role in Golot's plot for revenge. That is, when his father used him to spy on Pelléas and Melisandre. So we might see these independent individual meanings as the just below the surface layer of symbolism, but there are deeper layers that join all 3 of these objects. There's the fact that all 3 of them are precious objects that are irretrievable. Melisandre refuses to let Golot fish out her crown. The ring sinks down to the seemingly bottomless well, and Ineold's ball is pinned behind a rock and he can't reach it. These deeper layers of meaning are where the objects start to really transcend their status as mere things and start to encompass large and complex ideas or themes in this drama. Like Wagner's leitmotifs, they represent more than a single person or even a single concept. The changing dramatic contexts that they appear in endow them with a rich plurality of meanings. Attached to those simple little items, or to Wagner's simple little melodies, is a web of meanings and emotions that develops and expands over the course of the drama. So no composer's music was better suited to Maeterlinck's theatrical style than that of Claude Debussy, who, as we saw in last week's lecture, was occupied with the symbolist poetry of Mallarmé at the time that he started composing Pelléas in the early 1890s. In fact, in the year 1890, before he read the play and had attended its 1893 Paris premiere, somebody in an interview had asked him what his ideal opera libretto would look like, and Debussy had rather presciently predicted the structure and character of Maeterlinck's work, as well as his own future operatic adaptation, what that would look like. He responded, "No place nor time, no big scene, no compulsion on the musician, who must complete and give body to the work of the poet. Music in opera is far too cumbersome. The blossoming of the voice into true singing should occur only when required. My idea is of a short libretto with mobile scenes, a variety of scenes in regard to place and character, no discussion or arguments between the characters, whom I see at the mercy of life or destiny." Or in other words, Pelléas and Melisande, which Debussy again hadn't read or seen at the time of that interview. Now, as with Maeterlinck's text, we can see aspects of Debussy's music that are indebted to Wagner, but which take Wagner's idea in a totally new direction. We can start at the level of the text, which is revolutionary for the sole fact that Debussy didn't touch Maeterlinck's play, or at least he only touched it minimally. So spoken plays, straight theater, as you'd imagine, are one of the main sources that composers used to pull on for their libretti. However, since music depended on the metric and rhyming repetition of verse, plays that weren't written in poetry had to be what's sometimes called versified. That is, a librettist, someone other than the composer, had to take the language and plot of the original and rewrite it in poetic verse so that the composer could then set it to music. Debussy, when he discovered Maeterlinck's play, was occupied with another opera called Rodrigue et Chimène, which is based on the medieval legend of El Cid. Now, the libretto for that opera, like most traditional non-Wagnerian operas at the time, it alternated between non-poetic passages of dialogue, the recitative, and passages of rhyming metrical poetry, again, the numbers. But if you listen to the unfinished score that Debussy wrote, and he had actually finished most of the opera, just he didn't get to the orchestrations and some little editing that he would have done. There was another composer later on who filled out the orchestration, so you can hear what the opera would have sounded like. And if you listen to it, when he sets the poetry of the arias and the duets, the numbers, he mostly avoids following the repetitions of the text. Just like how Saint-Saëns had done with this, whenever the meter or the rhyme scheme repeats, his music repeats. Debussy avoided that, even though it was signaled that he should do that in the text. If two lines rhyme, he won't give them an identical melody. In a very Wagnerian manner, there's little difference between the way that Debussy sets the dialogue and the way he sets the numbers. The vocal line, as in Wagner's operas, tends to float somewhere in the middle of this continuum between recitative and a more song-like setting. So Debussy was actually resisting the structure of the libretto with his vocal lines, which raises the question of why set a verse libretto at all? I think this must have been a determining factor in why he abandoned this unfinished opera, Rodrigue et Chimène, despite having completed most of the score. He didn't want a text that placed textual constraints on him, implicitly demanding exact rhythmic and melodic repetitions to correspond with the poetry's repetitions. Rather, he wanted a text that would be looser and allow for a more improvisatory flow of his own melodies, a quality that you heard in the Afternoon of a Faun, the flute solo especially. And I think I mentioned this last time, but the flute solo never repeats the same way twice. Even though the theme keeps coming back, there's always new variations on it. So Debussy didn't want to be tied down by exact repetition. He wanted to have a text that would allow for that kind of freedom, of that kind of improvisatory musical freedom. So the clearest solution then would be to select a play that was in prosaic dialogue and that wasn't written in poetic meter. Some plays are written in poetic meter, and parts of large sections of Shakespeare are written in what's called blank verse. So the lines don't rhyme, but they have the same number of syllables and the same rhythm. This same meter in the iambic pentameter is what, if you'll remember from high school Shakespeare English class. But what Debussy would have been, my ideal libretto for Debussy would be a play that wasn't written in this kind of verse. Rather than hire a librettist to versify the text and make a clear delineation between recitative and arias, which Debussy would then have had to have adhered to with his musical setting, instead of that, Debussy chose to more or less leave the original text of Maeterlinck's play alone. Granted, Debussy did make some cuts and minor word changes or rearrangements to suit his musical needs from time to time, but most of these were for the sake of dramatic succinctness, since it takes so much longer to sing than it does to speak. And he may have actually improved on Maeterlinck's play in many ways with his textual edits. For instance, Debussy very wisely cut the first scene of the play, which is a scene where some servants are cleaning the front steps of the castle. And obviously that doesn't appear in the opera. The first, Debussy kind of jumps right into the plot of the play by starting with that initial encounter between Golot and Melisande, and I think that actually improves on Maeterlinck's play, rather than having this this little scene, this kind of prologue scene that we go right into the action. While we can see some clear similarities to Wagner's more flexible librettos, we should also remember that Wagner, though he largely did away with verse, still retained some poetic aspects in his texts. Which he wrote with a musical. He wrote these librettos with a musical setting in mind. As he was writing, he could predict what his musical response would be and what kind of text would elicit that musical response. So, for instance, in Wotan's monologue, there are the moments where he reverts to rhyming poetry or utilizes that German internal alliterative rhyming, all those words beginning with F. Maeterlinck, while his spoken dialogue certainly has some very musical qualities, didn't have an operatic setting in mind. As a result, Debussy's vocal lines tend to lean more toward the recitative side of our Wagnerian continuum. Most of the opera is sung in what's called a parlando style, meaning spoken in Italian. And this is a musical singing style that approximates the natural rhythm and contours of speech. So recitative style, parlando. But unlike Italian and German, the other two big operatic languages, spoken French tends to hover somewhat monotonously with fewer of the accented or stressed syllables of other languages. I'm thinking of a line from a poem by Verlaine, another symbolist poet that Debussy admired and set a lot of his poetry to music. And he has this poem, Il pleure dans mon cœur comme il pleut sur la ville. It's weeping in my heart like it's raining on the town, on the city. And you can hear that I mean, it's exaggerated. He's chosen those words for their long vowels. Il pleure dans mon cœur comme il pleut sur la ville. So Debussy too exaggerates that quality of the language, and his text setting can be literally monotone. That is, the singers recite long stretches of dialogue on one pitch, monotone, one tone. So you can see a great example in the first two lines that are spoken in the opera, when Golot remarks that he is lost in the forest and he's searching for whatever animal that he shot. See how both lines consist of three tones, a high, a medium, and a low pitch. In the first line, F is the main pitch that the singer mostly sticks to, only rising on the second syllable of sortir, which naturally rises up somewhat when it's spoken. Debussy also does this to mark an important word, or sortir, or to leave, since Golo is trying to get out of the forest. And it also gives a little variety to the middle of the melody line, so we're not stuck on F the whole time. He also drops to a D flat on the last word, which almost serves like a musical punctuation mark, letting us hear melodically that the sentence is over. So for this second line, he jumps back up to F, letting us know it's the start of a new sentence, but he changes the upper pitch to B flat. And the final pitch is a G flat, which is a half step higher than F. So the relative positions of the pitch of the high, medium, and low changes, but there's still only 3 pitches, just like there was in the previous line. And again, this provides some variety in the pitch content, so we don't have exactly the same notes as in the first sentence, but the 2 lines share, like I said, that similar 3-tiered contour, rising to a second pitch somewhere in the middle of each sentence, and then dropping to the 3rd pitch at the end of each sentence. But this isn't to say that Debussy's opera is totally devoid of tunes. Recall what he said in that interview I quoted earlier, that, quote, "the blossoming of the voice into true singing should occur only when required." While he didn't have Pelléas and Melisande in mind when he said that, we can see how he kept to his word when he eventually composed the opera. He only allows the characters to transition from the parlando recitative style into what he calls true singing, or what we were calling a more song-like style. He only allows that to happen at important points in the drama. Most of those passages go to Pelléas, who is a more traditionally romantic and operatic character than Golo or Melisande. He's more verbal than Melisande, for instance, about articulating his attraction, and Debussy sets his passionate dialogue to these gorgeous, sweeping melodies that are reminiscent of that erotic middle section of the Afternoon of a Faun. I'm thinking, for example, of the moment where he gets lost in Melisande's hair, and it's this very erotic moment that he's almost making out with her hair, and he bursts out into this more song-like passage or of true singing, as Debussy calls it. So these moments are an incredible contrast with the recitative style that Debussy typically employs in the opera. By withholding the lyrical song-like style, he renders those few moments of true singing all the more beautiful. So we'll hear some of Pelléas in just a second, but I want to point out one of Melisande's song-like numbers. Melisande doesn't actually have all that much to sing in the opera. The love duets are largely one-sided, with Pelléas doing all the talking. So this little song she sings when she's brushing her hair at the beginning of Act 3 is such a little gem. This, I think, is the only moment in the opera that's in verse. But that's because within the context of the spoken play, Melisande is performing a song. That is, when this would have been performed as a straight play, the actress playing Melisande would have sung here. Although I should mention as an aside, I think Maeterlinck actually changed the text to Melisande's song to a different song text, but this was the original one that Debussy would have had in the printed play, so he used this one. Now, since Debussy adapted this as an opera, he adopted the spoken play for a sung opera, we expect the characters to always be singing. So this little passage is an example of what we call diegetic music. Diegetic is D-I-E-G-E-T-I-C. And that is music that the characters themselves, in the context of the opera's drama, are hearing the music that's being performed. Now, the singers themselves, who, unless they're idiots, they already know that it's all being sung. They better know, since they've learned how to sing these roles. But the characters, as independent of the singers, the characters in the world of the opera are aware of the same music that we hear as the audience in these moments of diegetic music. They're usually deaf to all the recitative and song-like passages that we, as the audience, hear, which they, in the world of the drama, hear as spoken dialogue. But the diegetic music, which typically takes the form of, say, a dance music or songs like Melisande, the characters hear that as music, not as spoken dialogue. So you have to kind of imagine these two worlds: the real world that we exist in the theater, and we can hear, we obviously hear the music, and the world within the opera, where the characters think that they're speaking, even though the singers portraying them are singing. I hope that makes sense. Debussy then gives this passage, Melisande's song, a more song-like setting, again, what he calls true singing. And he's doing that to signal to the audience that Melisande is singing to herself in this moment, both the singer portraying Melisande and the character Melisande herself. So notice how Debussy's setting, his musical setting, is a more traditional setting of verse, where he repeats portions of the melody to match the repetition in the song's poem. Again, that's because this is supposed to be a folk song that Melisande has heard. It's not supposed to be symbolist music of the early 20th century, avant-garde music. It's supposed to be simple, naive, a little folk song that Melisande might know. That's why he reverts to this more old-fashioned musical style. And finally, in order to convey to the audience that this is a diegetic song, Debussy has the orchestra totally drop out. If you look back to the clip, the accompaniment in the score, that is the double staff below the vocal line, is totally empty. Melisande is singing unaccompanied here, or what you might have heard called singing a cappella, like a cappella groups, since they're not accompanied by instruments. But more than just a little realistic touch, the lack of instrumental accompaniment during Melisande's song is also indicative of just how faithful Debussy is to Maeterlinck's symbolist dialogue. So remember all those ellipses, the dots that punctuate the original play. Remember that they seem to signal some kind of pregnant pause where the audience is invited to reflect on what's being left unsaid. Last week, we discussed just how subdued Debussy's music for the Afternoon of a Faun is, how the central erotic section of the piece is the loudest and most active that the score ever gets, and how much of the work consists of instrumentalists playing solo. Notably, there's that flute solo at the very beginning, which was such a daring gesture for the time, to have a piece start with just a flute, unaccompanied, for 4 measures. I didn't mention, however, that there is even a thrilling moment following the flute solo where no one is playing. Not the silence before the piece starts, but the piece starts, and then there's a moment of, notated in the score, of silence. So you hear a harp glissando, and then the faint sound of an echoing horn. Though Debussy uses two horns to create the echo effect. You have to have one, the original one, and then the echo horn. It's like we're hearing this sound from deep in the forest, and we pause to strain our ear in the measure of silence to see if we can still hear the horns. That horn solo remains hovering and reverberating in whatever concert house you're in, before fading into silence during that measure. But maybe our brain even tricks us into thinking that we still hear something. This is symbolism applied to audio perception. He only suggests a sound and allows the subjective listener to fill in the rest. So this restrained orchestral writing transfers beautifully to Pelléas and Melisande, where we're also forced to fill in characters' unexpressed emotions from just the few short, ambiguous, and half-muttered statements they make, and then the silence, the ... silence that follows. So aside from the subdued dynamics, the volume level of the work, Debussy experiments with silence again, and to a fantastic effect. Notably at the moment that Pelléas and Melisande admit their love to one another. Now, at the analogous moment in Tristan and Isolde, which also takes place at a garden at night, Wagner, as you'd imagine, totally unleashes the orchestra and the voices. Tristan and Isolde, during their secret tryst, sing an incredibly long and long love duet that starts to build up to the same orgasmic finale that we'll hear repeated at the end of the opera as Isolde's Liebestod. Debussy, however, gives us the same dramatic situation, or Maeterlinck does rather, but Debussy gives us the exact opposite aesthetic in his music. Let's listen to that.
Cela d'une voix qui vient du bout du monde. Je ne t'ai presque pas entendu. Tu m'aimes aussi. Depuis quand m'aimes-tu?
Depuis toujours, depuis que je t'ai vu.
So while Debussy does build up to Pelléas's Je t'aime with a big orchestral crescendo, it suddenly breaks off into silence before he pronounces those words. And the next three measures are sung entirely unaccompanied. Melisande is instructed to sing her response, Je t'aime aussi, I love you too, which, by the way, notice that it's got that trailing ... ellipsis at the end. Debussy instructs her to sing in a low voice. But it's also on a pitch that's the bottommost note in a soprano's range, that middle C there. So it's going to be difficult anyway for the singer to perform this in full voice, and it'll come out naturally hushed. Pelléas immediately says that he just barely heard what she said, and the same goes for us as an audience. But once he fully realizes what she said, he describes her voice as coming from another world. It's a very Wagnerian turn of phrase, and Pelléas does enter into a very Wagnerian melody in the love duet, though, like I said, it's mostly a one-sided love duet. And this duet ends on what is admittedly a pretty Wagnerian climax for the couple, just before Golot interrupts them and murders Pelléas. So Wagner's influence is still pretty strong. But the actual moment when they admit their love to one another is utterly un-Wagnerian. It seems almost uneventful, like an absent-minded afterthought. It's not some orgasmic release of tension that's been building up, but rather a matter-of-fact trading of statements. Je t'aime aussi. Delivered at a near whisper that's barely audible. This love has been apparent to the audience for much of the drama, and Debussy realizes there's no need for fireworks here. Just as simple as Je t'aime, wrapped in the enveloping silence, which paradoxically speaks so much louder about love than any soaring string melody or blaring brass chord could. So given all these Wagnerian influences, or Debussy's uniquely un-Wagnerian responses to them, it shouldn't come as a surprise that Debussy adopts Wagner's leitmotif system. Though because the play is so scaled back in the number of characters, only 3 main characters and 3 secondary characters, the number of events, the number of props, and the number of settings, there are fewer opportunities for Debussy to attach leitmotifs to the things on stage. And so we have a far shorter list of leitmotifs than Wagner's enormous catalog of leitmotifs in the Ring Cycle. It's interesting to note that, publicly at least, Debussy was overly critical of Wagner's leitmotivic system and even made fun of it. So in a 1903 review of the Ring Cycle, he wrote, "How intolerable these men in helmets and animal skins are by the 4th evening. Remember, they never appear unless accompanied by their damnable leitmotif. And there are even those who sing it. It's rather like those silly people who hand you their visiting cards and then lyrically recite what's printed on them." Though humorous, this is a gross mischaracterization of Wagner's leitmotivic procedures, which, as we've seen, are much more sophisticated than Debussy would have us believe. We saw how Wagner layers psychological meanings by altering the rhythm, timbre, or harmony of his leitmotifs so that they retain their basic identity, but transform in character to suit the dramatic context. But Debussy's comments aren't just a mischaracterization, they're also incredibly hypocritical, since he himself had employed Wagner's leitmotivic system in Pelléas, which had just premiered in Paris in 1902, a year before he penned that review of the Ring Cycle. It's best never to take composers at their word. They tend to be very guarded about their artistic identities, and they don't like to give the impression that they may owe their techniques and style to their predecessors who paved the way for them. This is also an example of a modernist artist self-consciously trying to distance himself from the old-fashioned music of the recent past, to stake out his own artwork as something groundbreaking and innovative that owes nothing to received tradition. But Pelléas is indeed permeated with leitmotifs that act, at their most superficial level, as visiting cards for the characters. In fact, rather like a list of dramatis personae that precedes a play script, Debussy gives us a miniature catalog of leitmotifs in the prelude to his opera, or at least the leitmotifs for the 2 most important characters. Contrary to the title of the opera, I'm not counting Pelléas as one of the most important characters. His role in the opera is largely as an accessory. It's telling that Debussy leaves the Pelléas leitmotif out of the prelude, but once it does show up, it's so bland and forgettable that it's not even worth playing for you in this lecture. In fact, I couldn't even hum it for you if I tried. I don't remember what it sounds like. No, the 2 most important characters are Melisande and Golot. And this opera is about Golot's jealous abuse of a delicate woman that he plucked out of a forest, a woman whose depths of soul and immense capacity to love he never fully understands. So with this prelude to the opera, Debussy gives a beautifully compact leitmotivic painting of the central couple and the woodland setting that we find them in at the beginning. The first 4 bars are a solemn hymn-like evocation of the forest in some of the orchestra's lowest and woodiest instruments, the double basses, the cellos, and the bassoons, which if you don't know what a bassoon is, that's a large double reed instrument that's related to the oboe. Don't be a buffoon. Know what a bassoon is. Now the chords in this leitmotif even look on the page a little bit like tall trees. They're very open harmonies and almost a chant-like a medieval plain chant melody. And that's to give the impression of some medieval past. They set not only the physical environmental scene of the forest, but also the temporal scene. It's as if they were saying, once upon a time, or in French, il était une fois. We know from the sound of this leitmotif that we're in for a kind of fairy tale vision of an imaginary past. But the gloomy orchestration tells us already that it's not a happy ending. Yet this leitmotif is confined to the first scene of the opera. And while it does a lot of work in setting the scene, it's overshadowed by the other 2 leitmotifs in this prelude, which we hear much more in the opera, the rest of the opera. So immediately after the forest leitmotif, we get our first character, Golo, in his musical incarnation. So the dotted rhythm at the beginning of the second measure, this dum da dum, that rhythm is traditionally associated with horn calls. Wagner also uses a dotted rhythm in a ring cycle leitmotif, the one for the legendary sword Nothung that Siegfried wields, not yields. So on the surface, this motif seems to suggest some heroic, noble, outdoorsy person who would wield such a weapon like a sword. But the melody of the leitmotif suggests someone who is also very shallow and inflexible. The melody is the top pitch of each of the chords here. And you can see how Debussy merely oscillates between D and E. I've marked the D on the first chord and the E on the second chord. You can see he just goes back and forth between D and E. So already we know some things about Golo's character, even if we haven't heard him sing yet or seen how he interacts with the other characters. The Melisande leitmotif doesn't tell us as much about Melisande as the Golo does about Golo. It remains something ambiguous, like the character herself. This little 4-note motif, which I've circled in blue so you don't get confused with the accompanimental harmony, it repeats twice when it first appears in the prelude. While its melody doesn't divulge much information, the instrumental timbre on its first appearance tells us a lot. Debussy assigns Melisande's leitmotif to a solo oboe, again, our Jabba the Hutt oboe solo. And the oboe is an instrument that has a very melancholy and nasal sound that almost sounds like recalls a person weeping, which is, of course, an activity that we see Melisande doing throughout the opera, including here in the first scene when Golo stumbles upon her in the woods. Now, there are plenty of examples in the opera where Debussy, though he never gives due credit to Wagner, nevertheless imitates Wagner's sophisticated and proto-symbolist treatment of leitmotifs. There are plenty of examples, especially for these 2 character leitmotifs, which appear in the orchestra dozens of times in the score. But I'll call your attention to a very subtle yet potent use of Melisande's leitmotif during the tower scene, when Pelléas plays with Melisande's hair.
Tu m'as fait mal. Y a-t-il Péléas? Qu'est-ce qui vole autour de moi?
Ce sont les colomбes qui sortent de la ville. Je les ai effrayés et le savoir.
So Pelléas' shouting scares away Melisande's pet doves, and at that moment we hear a variation of her leitmotif played on tremolo strings. Remember, tremolo is a bowing technique where the string player executes a very quick quivering motion, hence the Italian name tremolando, which means trembling or flickering. Here, the leitmotif has a very literal surface meaning. The tremolo strings stand in for the quick fluttering of the dove's wings. But the fact that Debussy uses Melisandre's leitmotif here, rather than some new dove leitmotif, adds new layers of meaning. Debussy draws a musical connection between Melisandre and her doves. Not only is she gentle, beautiful, and easily frightened like a dove, she's trapped in captivity like a pet bird, both literally captured, since the castle is rather like a prison, and metaphorically imprisoned in her abusive marriage. It's almost as if Debussy is telling us that anything that the characters say about the doves in the lines that follow can also be applied to Melisandre, like when she says that the birds will get lost in the dark. Again, it's another symbolist instance of Maeterlinck's ostensibly simple and childlike phrases concealing secret meaning. And Debussy, employing Wagnerian methods, has musically strengthened the symbolic bond between Melisandre and her doves. His leitmotif for Melisandre accumulates these new meanings, so that when we hear it again, we don't only think of Melisandre the woman, but also of her doves, and all the emotional and psychological associations attached to that avian symbol. To close for today, I want to briefly address a fascinating synesthetic aspect of Debussy's score that's worth exploring, especially if you choose to choose a Pelléas and Melisandre for your project. And that is his musical language of lightness and darkness. There are plenty of moments, like the dove scene I described, where Debussy deepens our understanding of the characters through Wagnerian leitmotivic associations. But what I think is truly revolutionary on Debussy's part is not so much how he extracts leitmotifs or sonic symbols from Maeterlinck's characters in a Wagnerian manner, but how he musically handles Maeterlinck's literary leitmotifs, especially Maeterlinck's preoccupation with light. You may have noticed how obsessive the characters are about the extremes of darkness and light. So darkness, there's shadows, shade, night, wells, caves, castles, vaults, forests, storms, and blindness. And on the light side, sunlight, starlight, moonlight, midday, a lot of major events happen at noon, the glittering roof of the cave, the golden objects we discussed, candles, water-speckled roses, and ultimately the dying light of the sunset as Melisandre lies on her deathbed. Some of Debussy's most gorgeous passages of orchestral writing in the opera are depictions of the changing light. This isn't as systematic as his character leitmotifs. There's no single leitmotif for darkness and one for light. But Debussy does have what we might call a sonic palette, like a painter's palette that he dabs on to paint. So Debussy has kind of a sonic palette of intervals, rhythms, instrumental colors, even keys that he draws on. One palette for darkness and one for light. The most obvious difference is in instrumentation. So low, murky instruments are associated with the darkness. We heard this in the forest leitmotif in the prelude, which is played on bassoons, cellos, and double basses, three of the lowest pitched instruments in Debussy's orchestra. Elsewhere, he draws on the low brass, so tuba, trombones, sometimes horns, and the timpani. Notably, there's that fantastic solo timpani roll in the seventh measure of the prelude that functions a little bit like that silent measure at the beginning of the Afternoon of the Faun. So right after, I think you get the forest leitmotif, then Gounod's first statement of the leitmotif, and then one measure of just a timpani roll. That's a little bit like an echo or a depiction of a shadow. Typically for darkness, Debussy uses an oscillating half-step or whole-step ostinato. Now, an ostinato is a repeating motivic figure with a strong rhythmic drive. In popular music, it's called a riff. And we're going to discuss ostinato way more when we turn to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. But on the score, these oscillating ostinatos will look kind of like a sine wave shape as the players alternate between two notes, either a whole or a half step apart is usually the interval that Debussy chooses. We saw how that had created an erotic pulsing in the afternoon of a faun, but in Pelleas, this same figure evokes darkness. We'll see an example in a second, don't worry. Higher, brighter instruments are associated with light, especially the trumpets, the flute, triangle, and the high strings playing either tremolo or pizzicato, that is plucked. The glockenspiel, this little, it looks like a xylophone, but the little slats are made of metal and it makes a wonderful little bell sound. So the glockenspiel is used to great effect when Pelleas and Golot come out of the vault and back into the open air. And it's a beautiful representation of, Pelleas mentions that there's the roses have just been watered and there's little droplets of water and you can hear it in this glockenspiel. And then of course, the harp, which is, as we've seen, is one of Debussy's favorite instruments. So to represent light, he's always incorporating a harp glissando. That's when the harpist, rather than plucking individual strings, she drags her finger or her thumb. If it's the glissando is coming toward you, use the thumb. No. Yes, if it's away from you, you use the thumb like that. If it's toward you, you use, say, the middle finger, one of your fingers. So you drag your finger or your thumb along several strings to create this gorgeous reverberating, this fairy sound that runs up and down like a string of little bells. As for an audio example to play for you, I made a long list while I was listening to the opera with the score in hand a couple of weeks ago. And there's no way I could even begin to give you a mere sample of the moments of lightness and darks in the score. On the contrary, I would suggest that you give the opera another listen and try to pick out these moments on your own. Some of them are very subtle. I'll point out as a clue that there are plenty of clues in the dialogue, since the characters won't shut up about the light. By the way, Maeterlinck in his original play rarely indicates this in the stage directions what the lighting should be like in a particular scene. It would be the job of the director and the lighting designer of a production to go through the dialogue and pick out clues in order to light the production. Debussy is extremely attentive to this in his music, and the score often anticipates the changes in lights before the characters comment on it. That way that they have something to react to. So we hear the change in the light a few measures before a character says something like, oh, it's getting lighter out. So these moments when the light changes are some of the more memorable passages, since there's such a dramatic contrast in the music. Let's listen to the scene in the grotto, in the cave, when the moon comes out from behind the clouds and illuminates the top of the cave, which Pelleas has told us looks like a sky of stars when it's lit up. So for the darkness, we have an oscillating whole step on B flat and A flat in the trombone, tuba, viola, cello, and double bass. But then when the moon comes out, there's this gorgeous melody in the high woodwinds that might remind you of the middle theme from the Afternoon of a Faun. And of course, it's punctuated by plenty of harp glissandos. And note how the moonlight emerges in the music, and then Pelleas responds half a measure later with his exclamatory, "Oh, voici la clarté." The music here becomes a sonic representation of the visual light that Pelleas is reacting to. If this lecture has gotten any of you excited about this opera, which I will admit on first listen can be a bit tedious, but grows more and more fascinating as you study it. But if it has gotten you a little bit excited, at least, I would highly suggest you consider doing your project from the perspective of a lighting designer, even if you don't have any experience in your high school theater drama club or whatever, it's lighting. As a lighting designer, I would still suggest you look into this. You could do some really cool effects that sync up the musical light or musical shadows with the literal lights and shadows on stage. You could also find ways to incorporate lights and shadows of different colors. The characters even refer to green shadows and blue shadows. In fact, I remember walking along Bloor once, and I don't know if it was an effect of the light or some neon sign or something, but there were on the sidewalk, there were shadows that were blue. And it was just such a strange experience. It was a very symbolist experience, to be honest. If I were a poet, I would have written a poem, but I'm not. So I tell college students about it. No. So that's actually one of the reasons why I had you read this comic book adaptation. So P. Craig Russell, this artist, he actually started at DC Comics doing the ink work for the Batman comics, but he went on to do more artistic projects, like especially with opera librettos, adapting them to comic books. Notice how he gives each scene its own unique color palette in a very symbolist manner, which it differentiates between different shades of light and dark. For example, there's the putrid green and yellow shadows of the castle vault scene. It's almost like the color of absinthe, which was the favorite hallucinogenic drink that the symbolists and other artists of the turn of the century would drink. So compare that to the soft romantic blue shadows of Peleas and Melisandre's love scene. And that brings us to the final point I want to leave you with for this lecture: the fact that it's impossible to pin down a concrete meaning for light and dark in Maeterlinck's play and Debussy's score. When I mentioned that Debussy repeatedly uses an oscillating half or whole step figures for darkness, Gollot's leitmotif might have come to mind. Recall from the prelude that while Gollot's motive is very rhythmically active with its little dotted rhythm, it's melodically static, with just an oscillating whole step between D and E. So, aha! It's the same kind of oscillation that Debussy uses time and again to represent darkness. We might think we've got this all figured out, and we can just even apply a little syllogism. So Gollot equals bad. Gollot also equals oscillating whole step. Darkness equals oscillating whole step. QED, darkness equals bad. But that kind of absolutist darkness equals bad, light equals good dichotomy is the kind of overly simplistic and childish symbolic logic that only a man-child like George Lucas would engage in. Life isn't as simple as Star Wars, and we sure as heck can expect that a refined symbolist playwright like Maeterlinck wouldn't create a world that follows such a black and white, light and dark moral duality. For one, to view Gollot as an evil villain is to totally misunderstand the play, and human psychology for that matter. Like Shakespeare's Othello, he's a complex and multifaceted figure with good and bad traits. Though unfortunately, like Othello, his jealousy, rage, and suspicion get the better of his gentler nature. But there are little clues in the play that show a different side to Gollot, and while they may not excuse his actions, we can start to understand him better. We know that he has a son, and yet he's marrying a girl. So he must have had a wife, at least from the morality of medieval Europe, he must have had a wife at some point who passed away. While he never mentions that, at least I don't think he does, and he doesn't, Churzak doesn't reflect on it, how might that have affected his character? Also, he's aging. There's two little points in the text. In the first scene, when Melisande says, that he's graying in his hair. I forget exactly what she says. And then Inyald, when he's pricking he's pricked by Gollot's beer, he says that it's all gray. Again, Gollot never comes out and says, I feel self-conscious that I'm aging and I have a younger wife and I can't compete with a whippersnapper like Peleas. He never says that because it's a symbolist drama, but we can fill that out and flesh him out as a character. We can't get into a character study of Gollot right now, but I'll point out that his character, while often associated with darkness, isn't exclusively associated with darkness. On the one hand, he always seems to be lurking in the darkness when he spies on Peleus and Melisande. For instance, he stays down in the shadows when he lifts up little Inyol to the window where he sees the couple staring at the candle. And yet, metaphorically, Golo might be more accurately associated with light, especially when we consider his obsession with finding out about Peleus and Melisande's secret relationship, to shine a light on the truth, so to speak. Peleus and Melisande are exposed, remember, as they stand in the moonlight. Yet here again, Golo is creeping from the darkness and not in the light, even though the light plays an important tool for him here and in the earlier scene with Inyol. At any rate, the web of symbolic associations in true symbolist manner isn't clear-cut. Golo can be linked to darkness or light. Light can be associated with beauty and love, like the sparkly roof of the cave, but it also exposes horrible and even evil truths, like the starving paupers who sleep there in the cave, which is a very subtle bit of social commentary from Maeterlinck. For a quick moment, the soap opera problems of these noblemen seem insignificant when compared to the plight of their subjects. And the gold objects that we considered take on new meanings as symbols of these characters' aloof decadence, that their children play with gold balls while their people starve. Maeterlinck even brings into question our basic assumption of night and day being dark and light, respectively. The night can be full of stars and moonbeams, and the day can be murky and cloud-covered. Even in the darkest, murkiest scene, when Peleus gazes into the bottomless cesspool in the castle vaults, Golo holds up a lantern. Again, Golo here is the one associated with light, as he indirectly threatens Peleus with the deathly fate that this pit represents. So in the opera, it's never explained why they're going down to these vaults, these castle vaults, and there was actually a line in the original Maeterlinck that Debussy got rid of, but I think it said something like Golo says to Peleus, I want you to experience the smell of death. And that's why he brings them to this cesspool. I think Debussy, to make it even more subtle and more symbolist, got rid of that line. So we have to fill in for ourselves what could be the reason why they're down in these vaults. And then in the scene that follows, the brightest scene, where Peleus and Golo emerge blinking into the midday sun, we're still told that Melisande and Geneviève have retreated into the shade to escape the heat. So there seems to be this kind of yin and yang balance of darkness and light, with moments of darkness within the light, like the dot of black in the white side of the yin yang symbol, and vice versa. But unlike the concept of yin and yang, there's no firm dichotomy in the associations attached to darkness and light. The meanings of darkness and light are constantly shifting and even exchanging. To close, I pose a challenge to those of you who want to delve further into the symbolist world of Debussy's operatic adaptation. How does Debussy's music communicate these shifting meanings? How does his sonic light take on symbolist layers of meaning? And what might Debussy be telling us about the psychological states of the characters, which, as we've seen, are always manifested in the environments that they occupy and the objects that they come into contact with? We've seen how sensitive Debussy was to the subtle shifts in mood and light in Maeterlinck's play. Like the bottomless wells and caves in Peleus and Melisande, I think that as soon as we start to dive beneath the alternating sparkly or shadowy surface of Debussy's score, we'll discover that the layers of meaning get deeper and deeper. Peleus's answer to Melisande when they're peering down into the well, and she says she'd like to see the bottom of the well. That's Peleus's response is equally applicable to Debussy's score. He says, "It has never been seen. It may well be as deep as the sea." All right, guys, I hope this has illuminated light. Debussy's opera a little more for you, and given you a new picture of an opera that, like I said, initially might be a little off-putting, alienating, and a little bit boring, but really at its core is thrilling and psychologically and symbolically complex. So do have another listen, even if you're not following along with the libretto. Maybe give it another try and see if you enjoy it anymore. So next week we will be discussing an even darker opera, metaphorically darker. While it's glittering with jewels and gold bracelets and sexy strip teases, there's this moral decay at the center of Richard Strauss's adaptation of Oscar Wilde's Salome, one of the most exciting works on our syllabus. So you have something to look forward to, and something a little bit more musically active than Pelléas was this week. So toodaloo.